you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I am on the committee that's doing some of the, trying to help the people who are doing all the work, which is the staff here. And we have looked at some scripts and looked at the plans for this new museum. I think it is so exciting. I'm just delighted to be a small part of this project, and I'm really looking forward to seeing it open next summer. I think that's going to be just terrific. And you know, you don't see much when you drive by. You have to walk by, as I just did a few minutes ago. That building looks a lot different from what it did 3 years ago, the last time I was in there. The work that has been done is wonderful. So there's going to be some late hours between now and the exhibit. I used to work at the Adirondack Museum in Blue Mountain Lake, and the last week or so before opening was absolute chaos down there. And I expect it will be here too. Okay, I have written another book. Some of you may know I've written. It's a mix of things, but the thing that pulls it all together is the idea of wilderness, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. Wilderness is it's a cult, and I'm part of this cult, and that will be clear. It's controversial among environmental historians to talk about wilderness right now. It's vague, it's ambiguous. Nonetheless, this is what the book is about. And there are three interlocked ways that this book talks about wilderness. Let's do a little photo of some wilderness here. There we go. This is a place in the High Peaks Wilderness area. I won't tell you where it is. It's one of my favorite spots in the Adirondacks. It's the first place I spent the night out in the Adirondacks in June of 1966. Three interlocked themes, all connected to a search for meaning. What I'm looking for is meaning. Meaning for my own life, for my professional life, and I'm looking for, I'm going to talk about this tonight, the meaning of the provision in the New York State Constitution that provides for this wilderness in the Adirondacks, however we want to use that word. And that means I'm, at one point or another in here, I'm looking at wilderness as a part of American history. How does wilderness fit into our national story? Wilderness in the New York Constitution, as I mentioned, and wilderness in my personal and professional life. And that one I'm going to pretty much skip tonight. You'll have to read the book to learn more about that. But I'll just say, I'll touch on it a little bit at the end, but it has been very important for me. And it is, and I'll say the word to use for this is spiritual. It is a source of spiritual meaning for me and a lot of other people. And this is the part of Adirondack history that I have been concentrating on for 50 years. There are many other aspects of Adirondack history. There's agriculture, there is the history of commerce, there's history of religion in the park, there's the social and demographic and ethnic history. All these things are very important. But tonight, we're talking about wilderness. Okay, in the story of wilderness in American history, this is a book that some of you may be familiar with. It was published in 1967 by a professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He had just gotten his PhD in history from Yale, and it's called Wilderness and the American Mind. And this is the book that got me started. It got a lot of environmental historians started. It was a book tying the notion of the American wilderness to American political, cultural, and social history. How have attitudes toward wilderness changed over time? This book, when I was, my copy of this book I bought at the Adirondack Museum bookstore in 1968, a year after it was published, and it's still a very important book on my shelf. And I want to talk about what the book does, and then I want to talk about how it is not enough. There are problems with this book, and those problems have shown up in my own scholarship And I'm trying, part of one of the things my new book is trying to do is make corrections for the way my own scholarship has been incomplete. Okay, and roughly speaking, the narrative arc of wilderness in the American mind is that our history, our relationship to wilderness, goes through a satisfying arc. It started with hostility and revulsion and ended up with affection and appreciation and love. That's a very satisfying story. This is Cape Cod. It's a picture I took myself on Cape Cod. And this is an illustration of what the English settlers brought in their mental baggage to the continent that none of them knew anything about in 1620. And there's just a illustrative quotation about what this meant to the Pilgrims. 1620. You know, they landed on Cape Cod in November, having no idea what they were getting into. They were cold. Over half of them would die before the following spring. It was miserable. So it's understandable to a certain extent why they would be feeling so repelled by what they discovered in the New World. And they also brought to it centuries of European cultural baggage, that the wilderness is sinful. It's where you might, abandon civilization. You might become wild yourself. The devil lurks out there. And the Pilgrims and the English in general brought these preconceptions to the American wilderness. Okay, and now a whirlwind tour of American intellectual history to see where we go from there. And we'll jump ahead a couple of hundred years. William Bartram was represents the Enlightenment. He wrote a wonderful book called Travels about his explorations in Florida and the Southeast. It was published in 1784. It's one of the greatest pieces of literature of that era in American letters. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it, especially if you have a summer home in Florida or something on the St. John River and want to see what it was like. But for Roderick Nash, the point here is that from Puritan hostility, attitudes are changing. The Enlightenment tells us that nature is a wonderful mechanism, that it was set in motion by a benign deity, and it's not something to be afraid of, it's something to be studied. That the wilderness has answers to a lot of our questions. Makes a lot of sense. And so the Nash arc is moving from the Pilgrims to the Enlightenment, and the next stage is Romanticism. And now we're getting to the Adirondacks. This is a painting some of you may have seen down in Blue Mountain Lake. It's called A Good Time Coming. It's by Arthur Fitzwilliam Tate. I think it's either 1861 or 1862. And I present this as an example of how the wilderness, far from being something to be afraid of, has become something that we voluntarily go to. These are a couple of campers here. This is probably Tate. This is his friend James Blossom, who came along with the trip, and the other two fellows are guides. And they are there voluntarily. They want to be there. American Romanticism, a product of European Romanticism, tells them that nature itself is a source of spiritual, physical, moral redemption. It's a place to be sought out. The more natural, the better. And these two tourists, or sports as they were called then, have come here to get this revivifying impulse that you can absorb from the wilderness itself. Now this is the painting is also interesting because it begins to introduce some of the ways that the Nash narrative is incomplete. The two local fellows here, this one and this one, you'll notice, are doing all the work. Wilderness means something very different to them from what it means to Tate and Blossom. They built the lean-to. They brought all the gear. They owned the guide boats. They've done the fishing. The sports may have done some hunting, but it was only because they were led to the spot or taken out in a boat, pointed to the deer. There's even a story of occasionally the guide would have to grab a swimming deer by the tail and hold it while the sport blasted its head off. These were inexperienced people. They were urban people, and they were professional people. But they came to the Adirondacks because they wanted to get this redemption that nature could give them. But wilderness to them meant what Nash wants it to mean. It is this special place where we redeem ourselves. To the guides, it's where I live, it's where I work, it's where I labor. And in many respects, the two sports are, in a sense, performing their appreciation of the wilderness. And I use that word performing, as in it is a performative relationship. And I don't mean that to be derogatory. I mean that they're doing it aware of certain conventions and traditions, and they bring these cultural preconceptions with them to the Adirondacks. They are, in fact, constructing the wilderness that they want to see so badly. And the thing they construct is a function of their culture. Just as the thing that the guides construct, and they're constructing it too, is a function of their culture, and these cultures are very different. Almost exactly the same time, this painting. And I use this as I think it's supposed to be on Upper Saranac Lake. It's called A Twilight in the Adirondacks by Sanford Gifford. Both of these are in Blue Mountain Lake. I've always thought that if I was going to steal one painting from that collection, this is the one that I would take home with me. I absolutely adore this painting. You know, that other campsite completely dominates the canvas. Here the campsite is tiny. These people are surrounded by a nature that is a benign nature. It's glowing. It's radiating the presence of God. This is a perfect illustration of pantheism. God dwells in the landscape for these people. And so I use the word, as a pair with performative, transformative. This is a transformative experience for these people. And it is part of the growing arc, beginning with the Puritans, going through the Enlightenment. Now we're in America in the Romantic era. And so our attitudes toward wilderness are evolving very strongly. Okay, as an illustration, in words of that, oh no, that's tiny. I thought it would be bigger. You can't read that, can you? Can you read? Okay. Yeah. Joel T. Headley wrote a book about the Adirondacks in 1849. I think it was published. It was based on letters that he had sent to newspapers on the basis of several camping trips up here throughout the 1840s. And this became, in its way, a bestseller. It was a very popular book. And this book, I think, this quotation, I think, illustrates both the performative and the transformative. In one sense, it is just a list of cliches. It is so overwrought that it is a little bit that he's performing his appreciation for wilderness. But on the other hand, I think it's really honest. It is a genuine response to something that is really important. Headley had a nervous breakdown. He was one of the most popular writers of his day. He had a nervous breakdown. The doctor said, I think you need to go camping. He went up to the Adirondacks and more or less found what he was looking for and had a very successful career later on. He actually was Secretary of State in 1856 or something like that. He wrote a 5-volume biography of George Washington that was said at the time to be one of the 5 books most likely to be on an American bookshelf. So he's a very popular guy. And he came to the Adirondacks, published his book, came back after that, added to the book several times. The final edition comes out after the Civil War. But we've come a long way from William Bradford. That's the point. And Headley is discussed by Nash. Okay, just real quick to run through a little bit further of this, the Nash arc. That's John Muir, who probably our greatest wilderness writer, who no one has ever matched as responding to sublime scenery, to things like that. Oops. Go back. There. Obviously, this is Yosemite National Park. Those of you and me who've been there, it's one of the few things in adult life that does not disappoint. No matter how many pictures you've seen, how many Ansel Adams photographs you've seen, how many calendars from the Sierra Club, your jaw drops. But I still prefer the northeastern forests myself. So, sublime scenery, that adds on to the Nash narrative. And finally, the one more important element in the appreciation of wilderness is the rise of ecological thinking. The word ecology is invented, I think, in about 1924 or 5, something like that. And this is a shot from the Everglades. And all our national parks up until sort of the early 20th century were western. There were places of great scenery. And in the 1940s, a national park can be a giant swamp. And even John Muir might have been surprised by that. But I think it's a wonderful place. I go there almost every winter looking for birds. And the American wilderness has accumulated all these important attributes in the American mind. And Robert Nash is talking about the American mind. Okay, so that's one of the ways that wilderness fits into our story of American history. And now we come to a huge but. There's a lot left out here. For one thing, only in the 1960s could you talk about the American mind as if there is such a thing. It's a unified, homogeneous American mind. And unfortunately, if you read Wilderness in the American Mind, or you read my first book, called Forever Wild, which was largely an application of Nash's paradigm to the Adirondacks, you find out all the sources cited are white men, almost all of them well-educated. Practically all of them went to Harvard. And that's a great source, but it's not the American mind. There's a lot left out. So let's go back to William Bradford for a minute, who thought he had arrived at a wilderness. Well, we now know that in fact, cultures had been living there for hundreds and hundreds of years, and they had almost completely been wiped out by disease brought to them by European sailors and fishing boats. So what looked like a wilderness 50 years earlier had been fairly substantially inhabited. To think of it as wilderness is to take it out of history. In history, there's a story, there's a human dimension there. And so this is not in the traditional narrative. We need to acknowledge this. Here's a map of New York State, roughly at the time of the American Revolution. And what do we got out west? The Six Nations. And then coming up to the Adirondacks, this area right here, that's what it says. It still belongs to the Mohawks. It's not, in other words, the white people didn't discover this place. There were other people here first. Okay. And this is something that needs to be acknowledged. There are some people that say we shouldn't even use the word wilderness because it's racist, it's Eurocentric. I don't think there is any other word, so I found it useful. And this really came to a head. I'll keep going the wrong way. William Cronin, why are these so much bigger than the other ones? Cronin is a next generation American environmental historian, one of the great historians of his era. He's now retired too. He introduces the idea that wilderness is a construction. It's what we call a cultural or social construction. It is when we see what we expect to see, which doesn't mean it's a lie. It doesn't mean it's not there. Cronin himself was on the board of the Wilderness Society. You know, when he wrote a famous essay in 1995, published in the New York Times Magazine, called "The Trouble with Wilderness," where he pretty much dissected Roderick Nash's very satisfying story of appreciation being the ultimate goal, and the Wilderness Act of 1964 being the political demonstration of that arc. And he's saying that it is to think about wilderness in a non-serious way is to remove it from history, to not acknowledge its human history, to pretend that you're looking at something that's virgin. It's not. Okay, and I might add that for the Adirondacks, the story of how the native population, the indigenous population, has been significantly left out of our narratives, our histories of the Adirondacks. There's a wonderful book by Melissa Otis called Rural Indigenousness, and she also happens to be on the advisory committee for the new exhibit being planned next door. It's a really significant addition to our understanding of Adirondack history. Okay. Now, that said, I am not going to drop the value of wilderness. I continue to insist that wilderness is a valuable thing. We appreciate it by acknowledging its history. In the Adirondacks, that means there's an indigenous history here. There's also an industrial history here with logging and mining. The idea, for me, the important thing here is we're talking about rewilding. We're talking about a place that has a human history, but it is because of political decisions, it has an opportunity to rewild. And in the Adirondacks, in New York, why do we have that? And this is the final thing I want to mention here today, to see how this all fits into a New York story. And it starts there. That's something, words that I think everybody here is probably familiar with, or ought to be if you live in the Adirondacks. It's now Article 14, Section 1 of the New York State Constitution. You know, that's where we get the idea of forever wild, forever kept as wild forest lands. And an important part of it for our history here is this word right here. Real quickly talk about that a little bit. What does timber mean, and what does wild forest land mean? This was adopted in the Constitutional Convention held in Albany in 1894. And of course, there's a long history behind that, which you don't have time to go into. Logging was ruthless, it was hardly exploitative. The Adirondacks were on fire all the time because of the nature of logging. There was a great fear that two things would happen. One, that place that had all these redemptive, restorative values that Headley and others found, and a huge population of people who had discovered the Adirondacks, including Dr. Trudeau, would be destroyed because the logging would eliminate the resource. The other was that same logging was going to destroy the watershed, and there would be no water in the Erie Canal or the Hudson River, and New York commerce would suffer catastrophically. It was the Erie Canal that made New York the Empire State. And a lot of the water in the Erie Canal comes from the Adirondacks. If it's not reliable, we've got a problem. So the Constitutional Convention in 1894 added this to the New York State chief governing document. It's a little bit ambiguous, that's the problem. What does timber mean? And there's a little bit of, why do we emphasize timber so much? Okay, real quick, I'll tell you. The state of New York, which administers the Forest Reserve for all of us, has historically been reluctant to take this very seriously. And there have been three major bits of litigation in the 20th century, and then two in the 20th and one in the 21st century, where the courts have tried to restrain the state's interest in changing things. And first one thing I want to get to there is, come on. Advance me one there. There. Oh, okay. Oh, there you go. Why did they pass that provision? This is just one illustration of this part of the floor discussion at the 1894 convention. David McClure delivered these remarks into the record of the convention one of those days in December of 1894. Okay. Now the reason this is important is that in the litigations, which I'm going to mention by name in a minute, what happens is the state decides it wants to do something. In the 1920s, it decided it wanted to build a bobsled run in Lake Placid for the 1932 Olympics. And that meant cutting a lot of trees down. In the 1990s, it wanted to build a huge parking lot and ski system in the Catskills. And in 2013, it decided it wanted to build a bunch of snowmobile trails in the Adirondack Forest Reserve. All of those cases, the state was arguing that the word timber only means trees big enough to supply construction members or ship's timbers, something like that. That it's only big trees. It doesn't mean the little trees. Okay, and this was understood by the people who had written the original provision right from the start. And so 20 years later, when they have another constitutional convention, they voted to add this word in there to avoid ambiguity, to say it doesn't mean just the big trees. As I'm going to show in a minute, that doesn't mean what they say it means either. Okay, this was added in 1915. The reasons for adding it were this. There's been a delegate who spoke about it at that convention. And Delegate Dow had been at the 1894 convention. He was part of the group that had approved the original one. Another person was also there. Louis Marshall was arguing for improving this addition to the Constitution. He had been part of the committee that had proposed that original language in 1894. He was also a delegate in 1915. This seems so cumbersome. I'm sorry to get buried in the weeds here, but this is the kind of thing that major court decisions revolve around. And I'm going to get through this as quickly as I can. The Constitution was voted down for reasons that had nothing to do with the Forest Reserve. It was a very progressive Constitution. It was too progressive for the voters of New York, and they said, we don't want it. So the 1894 provision is, to this day, is what we use to decide what we're going to do about the Forest Reserve. Okay, these are the three cases that I mentioned, real quick. Bobsled run, big parking lot, snowmobile trail. Okay, I was an expert witness for this trial, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote this book. And the state of New York wanted to build a bunch of snowmobile trails called community connector trails. So you could go from bar to bar, from Minerva to Newcomb to Long Lake to Indian Lake, and have a lot of fun, which in general I don't really have a problem with. But they wanted to build them across the Forest Reserve, and they wanted to cut down a lot of trees. And they explicitly said that the word timber in the Constitution only means big trees and nothing else. Well, we show that that is incomplete. I don't know. Well, darn it.
Back.
I'm missing a slide. Well, in my efforts to improve my presentation, I seem to have dropped a slide. It was a page from Webster's International Dictionary of 1892, which was the definitive dictionary for American usage at the time the 1894 provision was written. And it defines the word timber. And it does say that wood that can be used for construction, remember, 2x4s, big beams, make a ship. It also says that wood that you can make tools out of. It also means the stem or trunk of a tree, or little things. My point, and the point that we made in our presentation to the court, beginning in Albany in 2013, was that the state's definition of timber is incomplete. To some of the delegates in 1894, it did mean what the state insisted that it meant. But to other delegates, it must have meant far more, because that was the standard usage of the time. The state's definition is not wrong, it is incomplete. Well, the justices of the Court of Appeals, where this ended up, agreed with us. And the state had to stop building those snowmobile trails. Now, as you may remember, this is very controversial. The supervisors of the 5 Adirondack towns where these trails were to be built, which was Indian Lake, Long Lake, Minerva, North Hudson, and Newcomb, had thought they had been promised these snowmobile trails and that they would be adding to their winter income. And that's as you know, the economy up here is kind of dead if you don't have a big ski slope for people to come to and Whiteface. And they were furious because, but the Constitution does not provide for these snowmobile trails. As the Court of Appeals said very clearly, if you want these snowmobile trails built, amend the Constitution, which has been done many times. It took amendments to build the trails at Whiteface. It took an amendment to build the road up Whiteface. It took an amendment to build the road from Saranac Lake to Tupper, the Long Lake to Old Forge. It has taken an amendment to enlarge a town cemetery, another one to enlarge a town dump. It's laborious, it's cumbersome, but it can be done. Constitutions should be amended when the need arises. But for now, anyway, the Constitution says that New York wants to protect wilderness. And the Court of Appeals made that explicit in their decision, that the protection of wilderness was a major reason why the Forest Reserve was protected by the Constitution at the Convention of 1894 in language that to a syllable, to a comma, is still part of our Constitution today. And that is why we have this wilderness, which we must think about in sophisticated ways, not easy ways, the way I think Robert Nash proposed to us in the 1960s. We need to be thinking always that there is a lot of history here, a lot of human history that's part of the story. And now just a couple of slides to remind us of what's so important out there. People come to the Adirondacks for a lot of reasons. A lot of people come up here for their camps and the family life that they have at their camps. A lot of people move here and want to live here because of all this open space, or because of the marvelous small town life that you have. Like most of my friends up here live in the town of Long Lake, which is really small. It's like 700 people. 2 years ago, there were 54 kids in a K-12 school, which is a problem, because it makes it hard to have athletics and theater and music and things like that. But a lot of other people love the Adirondacks because of this, because it is wilderness, because we are aware of its history. We're aware that a lot of this was logged at one time. It was burned. native people have been using it and hunting it, and this has been part of their domain for millennia. But it's important to us, and it's part of the New York State Constitution. It is part of a system of American values. We have the National Wilderness System, which was created in 1964, at the time mostly from national forests. Now it includes a lot of national parks and national monuments, BML lands. It's like 100 million acres now. In the Adirondacks, we have about 3 million acres in the forest reserve that belongs to all of us, and it's managed as wilderness according to the language of Article 14, Section 1 of the Constitution. Even though the state often wants to go further. They want to build, and for a long time they wanted to log the forest reserve in the early 20th century. They wanted to lease out campsites. They wanted to build cabins. They wanted to build a bobsled run. The Constitution does not allow for these things. And the people of New York have generally said, we don't want those things. Sometimes the state gets away with it. I'm pretty sure that the big state campgrounds, like Fish Creek, are illegal. They were built so long ago, I think it would be political suicide for anyone to try to change that. But they violated the Constitution with all the trees they cut down there to build all those parking areas and roads and so forth. This is a different place. Another one of my favorite spots. These are all my pictures. Throw those in there. And finally, my last slide, something like that. That's what I really love about the wilderness. It's process. It's natural processes. This is what makes the Everglades part of our national wilderness system at this point. It's a place where there's energy flow and predation, and trees live and they die and they go back in the soil. It's all a wonderful circle, and not to put too fine a point upon it, it is a place for many, many, many of us of a sort of religious meaning. And it's a function of American history that we've come to this point. It's a function very clearly of New York State history because of our Constitution that we've reached this point. And it's a valuable, it's a treasured resource for the Adirondacks and for the world. But it's never completely safe. An environmentalist friend of mine once pointed out that when you have environmental battles, like over snowmobile trails, the green side never wins. It can get a tie. It can lose, in which case the trails get built, or the trails get stopped. That's really a tie, because they're always going to come back. And that's the way the system works. They can take a constitutional amendment to the legislature, get it passed 2 times, send it to the people, and see what happens. Okay, I'd love to take questions if anybody has them. I've been putting this thing down here. I hope it hasn't. Okay. I think that is the end of my presentation. Anybody want to challenge or ask a question or anything? Yes, please.
I was just thinking that your presentation seemed to focus on sort of the human relationship with wilderness, but we share wilderness with a whole lot of other creatures and species and plants and trees.
Can't say everything, but that's absolutely true. That's part of the by using this word, by taking our preconceptions and layering them onto the physical reality that's out there, we tend to minimize. We tend to make our own place there too big in our thinking, and so that's a constant, something constantly to be resisted. Is to making the whole thing anthropogenic. It is a human creation, and in a sense, it is a human creation. But we need to think about all those, little fish and bacteria and all those rotten trees, which are wonderful, and it's incredibly complicated system of energy flow, of water, of chlorophyll, of tree growing, geology, tectonic, everything, which we don't understand particularly. We're still working on that, and so we got a long way to go. And that's another reason to leave it alone, because there are things out there that we don't get yet. So, but it works pretty well. What else?
I'm curious. I have a lot of ignorance around the history around Adirondack parks. I'm very familiar with the national park system in other states. I've lived in California for years. And Yosemite was my backyard playground. I went there quite frequently. It's a very different kind of established place where the village gets incorporated within the park domain is clearly part of the national park system. But here in Adirondack, the Adirondack Park, you have all of these towns and villages, and basically it's a very unusually structured natural wilderness. And how do you see the evolution of that in this frame of wilderness?
I think it's a good question, and it really puzzles Westerners, or it puzzles a lot of people from Brooklyn, for that matter, that we have this really strange arrangement here. The Forest Preserve was created to protect the watershed and to protect a place for people to save their souls and bodies in the wilderness. And it was very small, and it's grown over time. And the park was established in 1892, much smaller than it is now. But it was pretty much just that area of New York in which the state had a compelling interest. It was the headwaters of all the major rivers. And if you read the legislation of 1892, the people who wrote that really didn't pay any attention to the fact that there were tens of thousands of people living in this park. There were these towns. I'm not sure, Saranac Lake may have been just outside the original blue line, but if it not, I don't remember one way or the other. But I know that Long Lake and Newcomb and Racket Lake and Indian Lake and probably Cover Lake and North Creek, they were all inside the blue line, inside the park. And there is no acknowledgement of that in this legislation. And I think that the assumption was that eventually the state would own it all. Well, that became very quickly, obviously impossible, because the state didn't have the resources to do that. It only could acquire land when it came up, it had been logged, and it was cheap, and the company didn't want it anymore, and the state would get hold of it. Only once or twice in our entire history has the state exercised eminent domain. One time was to get Lake Colton, which is one really spectacular place. That was 100 years ago. Eminent domain is just poison. It will probably never be going to be used up here again. In other words, we have arrived here without intending to get here. So we have roughly half and half. And I think except for a few places where the state might acquire land now, this is pretty much what it's going to be. Once we figure out what's going to happen to Whitney Park, which is 36,000 acres in the town of Long Lake, and not sure about what's going to happen there, and maybe Litchfield Park, which is also in the town of Long Lake, and a couple of other major places, but this is probably the park we're going to have, pretty much the way it is right now, roughly 50-50. And I think that seems appropriate to me. It seems like a good settlement that we have this. The state of New York already does a lot to subsidize the towns that live up here. Most money flows into the Adirondacks. Decades ago, you'd go to any bar in the Adirondacks and somebody would claim that his taxes were supporting the welfare cheats in the Bronx. That is not true. The money comes in. For one thing, the state pays taxes on the Forest Reserve, which does not require bus routes or services or water lines or anything like that. They are taxed as if they were logging lands. And the state pays millions and millions of dollars to local school districts, local Adirondack counties, and Adirondack towns for all those lands. The town of Long Lake is 50% owned by the state. So that is why a town of 700 people can have a K through 12 school with 54 kids in it. And that is solely the result of the fact that the state is paying a lot of taxes. And a lot of people who don't have kids in those schools, who are seasonal residents or own logging plots, things like that, are paying taxes. And then all the tourist money that comes in here makes the economy. Nonetheless, it's hard to live in the Adirondacks. Rural America is in trouble, and this is rural America. I think you can make a case that rural America, as evidenced in the Adirondacks, is doing better than a lot of other rural America, like maybe most of rural America. And we did a report at Protect a few years ago on the demographics and the social fabric that makes up all the population of the Adirondacks, and we can show that Adirondack towns and villages, on average, are doing, in a series of metrics, poverty levels, annual income, a whole bunch of things, are doing better than similar towns in rural New York, the Northeast, and the United States. And these are places that do not have a forest reserve, that do not have an Adirondack Park agency, they do not have the zoning controls that we have in the Adirondacks. And it's because of the open space that's protected here that all these the people want to come here, and the state wants to protect the wilderness as it does in the Constitution. So that is opening up a huge, that's probably more than you wanted to hear. But
No, and
yeah, we
I'm
can
fascinated.
go on that. But the state has decided through its, our systems and politics and representative government and our courts, that the state will subsidize life for the towns in the Adirondacks. And the same thing with the Catskills. It owns a lower percentage of the Catskills than it does in the Adirondacks, but it still does the same thing. So this is a commitment to try to make life livable. It's really hard. I know people who run retail businesses in the Adirondacks. It's hard. It's hard everywhere, but it's really hard here where the economy is so seasonal. Okay?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
So two things. One, it is consistent with people who outside the park grant environmental easements, thereby increasing the value of their property. It is analogous to what we've done here in that functionally the park is a giant environmental easement and it leaves the remaining property more attractive to people to acquire. The other thing that
I didn't follow that. I'm not sure what you're talking about.
So if I sell to the Open Space Institute
Okay.
a piece of property that I own in Skinneapolis, New York,
Okay.
my property next door becomes more valuable. That's pretty well documented.
Okay.
And all this is a big version of that. There's a lot of other pieces to it. The other thing is, you said something that people need to worry about. You just said that we've made a decision that we're going to do this. And I would say to you, we have made the decision in the past.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not clear to me, and this is a topic I've been involved with in other environments, but as the demographic of the state of New York changes and becomes minority majority,
Mm-hmm.
to the extent that we do not have significant representation of the people who pay the taxes, the likelihood that the state will continue to do that diminishes, and it becomes important to us who live here to be aware of the fact that if we haven't got a representation of the people who are paying the taxes, they may decide they don't want to do that anymore.
Absolutely true. There's going to be the people of the state of New York, probably the next time, roughly in 2037, will be asked, do you want to have a constitutional convention? And at that point, it will have been since 1967, since a convention was held, which is longer than New York has ever gone without a convention. And issues like that will come up at that time. Do we want to have wild forest lands, timber thereon should not be sold, removed, or destroyed? And New York is a much different place now than it was 90 years ago or 120 years, and it's going to get more different. Absolutely.
I'm particularly fond of old architecture. I think history is overwhelmingly important. And I also think that if we do not, I'm gonna sort of make a small joke about what I'm saying. If we don't make this place more colorful, it may not be here.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. The next to last chapter in my book is titled Whose Wilderness? And the Forest Preserve, which is where this wilderness is, belongs to all the people of New York. And if people who aren't white don't feel welcome in the backcountry, eventually they're going to say, why in the hell are we paying taxes to keep that stuff?
Yep. I've been saying that for a while.
Yeah, and so that is an absolutely critical point. There are two things that are really important for the future. That's one, and the other is climate change.
Yes, and that one, by the way, because of the odd, the conflicts of interest between the Adirondack Council, which is the largest environmental group, and the Adirondack North Country Association, that's headquartered here. We have the Adirondack Diversity Initiative, the purpose of which is specifically to address that problem, and substantial money comes from the state budget to help with that problem, but we have to help with that problem.
It's got to be park-wide, grassroots, everything. I mean, it seems daunting, but
It seems rather simple. Everyone is welcome here.
Well,
it's on the sign in the
yeah.
pub in Tupper Lake.
walk into a bar in Indian Lake on a Saturday night and see if it's a popular attitude.
Depends on which bar it is. It does depend on which bar. I completely appreciate your point.
I'm hopeful. It's a complicated place. What was it? Was it 2 years ago or 3 years ago? Somebody went, Adirondack Lake had its carnival, and somebody drove a truck down the street with 2 Confederate flags on it, and there were boos and there were cheers. So, how do those of us who value the Forest Preserve want to see this place moving for the next decades?
We gotta use history to predict the future.
Yeah, well, sometimes it works.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
I just was pointing at that thing that you said, because I thought it was important to
Yeah,
have you
thanks,
expand on.
thanks, that's good. Good. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes?
Do
Thanks.
you want to tell people how they can?
Oh, well, I have some copies of the book that are for sale, right over there. And don't give me any money, I don't have it. You can buy them from the Historic Saranac Lake, and they will take your credit cards or whatever.
And if we run out of books, because we don't have a huge number of copies, but there will be more for sale soon in our shops.
Yeah, and if you want to order it before then, I have a hierarchy of places I'd like you to try. One is your local independent bookstore. 2, the next step down is Syracuse University Press at their website. And the point of last resort, if you can't do anything else, is Amazon. The bookstore right here be the place to go.
If I may throw, like, the number of independent bookstores in New York and the United States has dramatically increased in the last decade, the opposite of what I thought.
Yeah, it was plummeting
Yep.
for a long time.
It's like double or triple.
Remember when Borders was going to take over everything? Borders doesn't even exist anymore. And small bookstores are coming back. It's great. But it's a retail business and it's hard. These people work 14 hours a day.
And Barnes & Noble has thrived because they let the managers of every store functionally make it as a local bookstore.
There you go.
The business model is
Yeah.
that the local manager knows what his community wants and they serve their community. Again, we're a little off topic.
Okay. So, there you go. And I'll be, if anybody does want to buy one, I'd be glad to sign it. Okay, well, thanks for coming. Yes.